지금부터 아이판스 글로벌컨퍼런스 제2회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 주제는 어떻게 협력할 것인가입니다. 사회는 동아시아연구원 하영선 이사장님께서 맡아주시겠습니다.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to moderate the second sessions on how to cooperate in Northeast Asia for the peace and prosperity in East Asia and also trust politics on the Korean Peninsula. In the first session will already did very much successfully discuss the general background and the key aspects of the issues. I think the second sessions will cover a little bit more detailed, in-depth analysis or questions for this heavy task. For this purpose, in the beginning, the Vice Minister of ROK, Tae-yul, will give us a brief summary or presentation on the ROK positions on the Northeast Asia's Peace and Prosperity Initiative and also the trust politique on the Korean Peninsula. And after that, we are now having four panelists. Ambassador Gleb, IVASHENTSOV, former Russian ambassador to ROK, currently Deputy Director, Russian APEC Study Center. And secondly, Mr. Ifans REVERE, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, also the Korean Society President, currently Senior Director, Albright, Stonebridge Group, USA. Thirdly, Ambassador TAKANO Toshiyuki, he was former ambassador to ROK, currently Senior Advisor of IDOT's Cooperation. And finally, Professor Hugh, he was former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Intelligence and currently Professor of ANU University. So after roughly 15 minutes presentations, all the panelists will use roughly 7 or 8 minutes presentation for their own view in the first round of discussions. After that, from the second round of discussions, we will rather freely discuss the topics raised up in the first round of discussions. So I will invite first the Vice Minister Cho.
Thank you, Professor Ha. Well, as I understand, President Park and Dr. Yoon discussed earlier today the vision and basic concept of Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative and trust politique, the philosophical basis on which the initiative has further developed. I'd like to focus my presentation on how to implement it today. For the sake of convenience, I'd like to refer to the initiative as NAPCI or NAPC throughout my presentation. I'll discuss first how NAPC differs from the initiatives of previous administrations for multilateral security cooperation in Northeast Asia. Second, what are the basic approaches and principles in pursuing the initiative? Third, what we have done so far and will do in the coming years and months and years to implement it. And last, what are the major challenges in pursuing the initiative? Let me first explain to you how this particular initiative differs from the previous Northeast Asian initiatives. All the previous administrations since President Tae-yul in the late 1980s proposed some types of initiatives for Northeast Asia cooperation. And as I understand it, some people think that NAPC is not all that different from these initiatives. However, the Park Geun-hye government is not pursuing this initiative simply because previous administrations had made the similar proposals. Rather, the initiative is being pursued from a very realistic and practical perspective based on an objective understanding of the political reality in Northeast Asia, which is currently faced with a crisis of trust or Asia paradox, as I'm sure was probably mentioned by President Park and Dr. Yoon earlier today. In recognition that building trust is the precondition for cooperation, This initiative differs from the previous ones in two ways. First, it aims to promote a culture of regional cooperation grounded in trust. And second, it focuses on accumulating practices and habits of dialogue and cooperation, starting with the softer issues and areas. Previous initiatives until the Kim Dae-jung administration in the late 1990s focused on cooperation on traditional security issues. They employed a top-down approach based on political agreements between the leaders rather than building trust through the concrete projects of cooperation. Therefore, they were never implemented in full. The Nomuyon administration, on the other hand, did pursue an initiative for cooperation in Northeast Asia in areas that included non-traditional soft security issues. The initiative also aimed to pursue concrete projects of cooperation, such as establishing Northeast Asia security and economic communities. However, it proved difficult to pursue such projects as they were too grand in scale. NAPS is pursued reflecting on the lessons learned from the experiences of previous administrations and with a focus on whether or not cooperation projects or dialogues are executable and their desired goals are achievable. Now I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on the basic approaches and principles we are going to uphold in pursuing the initiative. First, the initiative takes a step-by-step and gradual approach. It is an evolving and process-oriented policy and is not aimed at hastily achieving tangible outcome. Therefore, the outcome can vary depending on the degree of interest of the countries in the region. We will not consider launching an organization until the conditions are ripe. Second, the initiative will be pursued at a speed that all stakeholders can be at ease with. We will start cooperating with countries that are ready to participate in areas where cooperation is relatively easy and at the working level where the burden is less. We will expand the scope of cooperation only with the consent of the participating countries. Number three, the initiative aims to build on the existing cooperation mechanism in the region. In Northeast Asia, there exist a number of cooperation mechanisms in a wide range of areas. TCS, a Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat, in particular, among China, Japan, and Korea, is a good example. By connecting and complementing these existing cooperation mechanisms and revitalizing their activities within the larger framework of NAPSI, we can build an infrastructure of trust in the region. In areas where no cooperation mechanism exists, the initiative intends to create new processes of dialogue and cooperation. Number four, the initiative intends to be multi-layered and multidimensional. It will be carried out at many levels, including track 1 or track 1.5 or track 2, so that cooperation at each level will be mutually reinforcing and complementing. At the initial stage, we intend to take a bottom-up approach, starting with softer and less controversial issues, such as climate change, energy security, disaster relief, and nuclear safety. But we do not preclude taking a top-down approach if and when political commitment can be affirmed after building a certain level of trust. We will seek ways of cooperation that go beyond the given process. Number five, the initiative aims for an open dialogue and cooperation. The interested countries in the region are all welcome. North Korea, of course, will be encouraged to participate from the early stages of cooperation. The initiative also seeks to gradually link other stakeholders directly or indirectly. In the future, we will also consider inviting regional and international organizations as observers so that we can share and get inspirations from their experiences and lessons learned in promoting regional cooperation. This is to leave open the possibility of linking regional cooperation in Northeast Asia with cooperation in other regions such as Southeast Asia and Europe. Finally, we hope that all participating countries will feel a sense of ownership over the initiative. Rather than a particular country leading the process, the initiative aims for the active and voluntary participation of all interested countries. If any country already took a leading role or is interested in pursuing cooperation in a specific area, Korea is ready to play a facilitator's role so that the said country can lead the process. Let me now move on to the next subject, what we have done and will do to implement the initiative. Since its inauguration in February, the Korean government has been working very hard to win international support for the initiative by actively engaging in high-level diplomacy, both bilateral and multilateral, including in particular summit meetings. It was President Park who has been at the forefront in all these efforts, which started even before she assumed office. In 2011, as you know, President Park presented a vision of NAPSI and its underlying philosophy, trust politic, in a contribution to foreign affairs titled A New Kind of Korea. Since taking office, she has elaborated on a vision of NAPSI in many policy speeches, including, among others, at the joint session of the US Congress and Tsinghua University in Beijing, which were both very well received by the audience. All the leaders with whom she had summit meetings, including Presidents Obama and Xi Jinping, also showed respect and support for the initiative, including through joint statements. President Park was also able to get recognition for the initiative in the multilateral fora, such as G20, ASEAN Plus 3, and ASEAN Plus 1, EAS, and APEC. In particular, she was able to get explicit support for the initiative in the chairman's statements of ASEAN Plus 3, EAS, and ASEAN Plus 1 summit. And cooperation with NATO is also worthy to note. After meeting with President Park in Seoul, NATO Secretary General Rasmussen took an initiative to organize an international conference to be jointly hosted by Korean and Swedish think tanks sometime next year to shed light on the implications of the European multilateral security cooperation for the initiative. Foreign Minister Yoon has also done his due part in garnering international support for the initiative. He has been able to secure supports from all his counterparts he met so far in both bilateral and multilateral settings. Minister Yoon has also been active in selling the initiative to the public at home and abroad by making a number of policy speeches, such as at the Koreasosaiorty at New York in October, as well as by writing articles such as one to Global Asia magazine on the philosophy of trust politic as the foundation of the initiative. I too have added my own contribution to these efforts. In particular, I discussed this initiative with OSCE Secretary General Zanier 3 times, first in Ulaanbaatar, second in Vienna, and third in Seoul recently. Secretary General Zanier found the initiative quite interesting and promised to assist us in areas where the OSCE can make a contribution. Since then, working level contact has been maintained between the OSCE Secretariat and the Korean government to explore the avenues of cooperation on this initiative. Secretary General Zanier is currently on his visit to Seoul, and he presented his views on NAPSI at the Seoul Defense Dialogue held earlier this week. I also played a role in Korea's taking initiatives for a series of informal meetings among 5 countries in Northeast Asia on several soft issues within the framework of NAPSI. In early July, on the occasion of the IAEA International Conference on Nuclear Security in Vienna, I hosted a breakfast meeting inviting the representatives of the 4 Northeast Asian countries and sounded out their reactions on cooperation on nuclear safety issues in Northeast Asia, an issue I believe was very much relevant, particularly in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident in Japan. Since then, similar meetings have been held under my initiative on other soft issues such as energy security, cyberspace, and environmental cooperation, respectively taking advantage of the World Energy Congress in Daegu and the Seoul Conference on Cyberspace, both held in October, as well as Northeast Asian Sub-Regional Program for Environmental Cooperation, or NISPEC, held in Ulaanbaatar in early November. We will work on the follow-up actions to these informal meetings based on the feedbacks from the participating countries and continue to explore the possibility of launching informal dialogues on these and other soft issues wherever available and appropriate. As part of this effort, next year we plan to host a 1.5-track Seoul forum so that the countries in the region can raise ideas on any issues that they believe need cooperation across all areas. This leads to the final subject of my presentation, major challenges in pursuing the initiative. In the aforementioned informal meetings I hosted on soft issues, a common question raised by participating countries was, what is added value in this initiative? They were not yet convinced of the need to create an additional process or mechanism given the fact that the regional and international organizations mechanisms of cooperation already exist in many areas and are readily available to the use in regional context as well. It is true that many cooperative mechanisms or projects are already underway in Northeast Asia, and today they are still evolving, but they are short of security perspectives. Virtually all the existing mechanisms in Northeast Asia are focused on technical and functional cooperation without putting it in a broader context of the regional peace and stability. NAPSI is aimed at adding a security dimension to the regional cooperation mechanisms by linking the existing mechanisms within the larger framework of NAPSI, and if necessary and available, by creating new processes or mechanisms of dialogue and cooperation on selected soft security issues. Another question commonly raised by participating countries was what to do with North Korea. More specifically, the question was, is it not the 6-1 structure that excludes North Korea? Without a doubt, we have no intention of excluding North Korea. Rather, we will continue to engage North Korea from the early stages of cooperation on any issues. If it takes more time for North Korea to consider joining the initiative, we will start it in a low-key manner so as not to irritate Pyongyang. Under any circumstances, we will leave the door open for North Korea's participation at the time of its own choice. Some people also question whether this initiative is feasible, given that the relations between Korea and Japan and relations between China and Japan are strained. The current state of bilateral and trilateral cooperation among the countries in Northeast Asia can hinder the process of cooperation. But trilateral cooperation has evolved very rapidly in a wide range of areas over the past decades, regardless of political ups and downs. Collective efforts to build trust are all the more necessary, especially when the political relations are strained. In this regard, I'd like to quote Mr. Zanier, Secretary General of OSCE's remarks at the Seoul Defense Dialogue the day before yesterday. I quote, "OSCE made a substantial contribution to building peace in a deeply polarized world in which an atmosphere of hostility and mistrust prevailed," unquote. This is a very brief sketch of how we are going to work with the countries interested in pursuing NAPSI. We know that a number of challenges lie ahead in our efforts, and that some people are even saying that, raising skepticism as to whether this initiative is feasible. However, such skeptics cannot be the reason why we should give up our efforts to accumulate practices and habits of dialogue and cooperation in this region facing a crisis of trust. Certainly, Korea cannot do it alone. Various stakeholders in and out of the region should participate voluntarily and actively in the efforts. Keeping in mind all the potential challenges, we will continue to work together with the governments of the interested countries, academia, corporations, and the civil society to promote a culture of cooperation and thereby overcome the so-called Asia paradox in this region. I'd like to conclude my presentation by quoting once again OSCE Secretary General Mr. Zanier's remarks. I quote again, "Building trust should be seen as both a process and an end goal. It takes time and patience, and often there are setbacks along the way." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Minister Cho. Vice Minister Cho gave us a rather summary of ROK's efforts for the Northeast Asia's Peace and Prosperity Initiative. Before going into our panelists' presentations, I would sum up in a little bit different way for our productive discussions. It seems to me in the next several years, we will face the three cluster of challenges we have to face, or we will face, if we will want to implement the very much success of the Northeast Asia's Peace and Prosperity Initiative. First one is political military cluster of dilemmas or challenges we will face. As we already discussed in the first sessions, the first one is relations between the US and China. Although there is a rather good strategic trust which is now beginning between two countries on the rebalancing to Asia Pacific, and also the new model of major power relations. And secondly, we also have to tackle what the North Korean nuclear issues. Sooner or later, we will have a six-party talks, what kind of the new initiative, new ideas for us to have a new successful round of the discussions on these heavy topics. Third, political military issues as between China and Japan relations. And fourth one is the Korea-Japan relations, I think. That four major questions can be the first cluster of challenges we have to solve. Second cluster of challenges, of course, is economies. Well, everybody, we agree that the world economy, future of world economy is very much dependent upon the economy of East Asia or economy of Asia Pacific. It means that we discuss and further on how we can maintain the current trends of the growing sustainable growth of East Asia or Asia Pacific economy. And final cluster of the challenges is a kind of the new agendas cluster of changes, such as the environment, culture, information, and technology. In that arena, we are not yet to establish a kind of the new framework of regional governance to manage such kind of the new issues. In addition to that, we do have a strong hope there will be a strong kind of effective spillover from the successful arrangement of the rather non-political economic issues to when we solve the rather transnational issues in this region. That will give a positive effect on the traditional difficult issues such as political military issues or economic issues. But when we look back to history and theories, it's not an easy work. So from that kind of three clusters, complex relations among these three clusters should be discussed during the second session, I guess. Ambassador IVASHENTSOV, will be your turn. You will give us your own view on these tough questions.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dear participants, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to take part in a very important discussion, because I think that President Park Geun-hye's initiative on peace and security in Northeast Asia is of tantamount importance for today. Because here in Northeast Asia, we have the most important issues to be settled. First of all, the threat of an armed conflict here. Here we have the concentration of economic power and also concentration of a lot of challenges. All kinds of challenges, financial challenges, economic challenges, political challenges. And these security challenges in Northeast Asia are of Russia's direct concern. For nowhere else, the foreign and domestic interests of Russia are as interlinked as in that region. The future of Russia as a great power depends on economic, technological, and social advance of Siberia and the Russian Far East, which is possible with peace and security on the borders only. The urgency of task of securing peaceful cooperation in the region is obvious. Northeast Asia, as President Park Geun-hye noted quite correctly, remains as the sole region in the world where a multilateral mechanism to address various issues of common interest and resolve conflict among regional members has never come into being. The security architecture which exists there today was formed in the Cold War time in the format of United States-USSR confrontation. It corresponds neither to the present configuration of field of forces in Asia-Pacific, nor to the tasks of fighting current global and regional threats, and therefore needs a radical reconstruction. Where to start from? President Park Geun-hye, while proposing an initiative, spoke of beginning with accumulating small but significant interactions in soft cooperative security issues, such as environment, disaster relief, nuclear power safety, and counterterrorism, so that they turn into habits of cooperation. It is presumed that eventually these habits of cooperation can be nurtured into building of trust that will usher in a discussion on broader issues of peace and development in the region. It could be useful, I think, to supplement the above list of issues for initial discussion with energy security. While political and military interests of different countries may differ, energy security is one that all economies of the region share a common interest in. By 2020, Northeast Asia will consume half of the world's energy. Global financial uncertainties, political developments in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Fukushima disaster, all this, along with growth of harmful emissions and climate changes, have added new sensitive nuances and accents to energy situation in Northeast Asia. Settlements of the problems demands joint efforts. Russia, on her part, could do much for energy security in Northeast Asia, which is evidenced by her energy dialogue with South Korea. Within last years, South Korean companies got billions of dollars orders for building machinery and equipment for energy projects in Russia, as well as oil and LNG carriers. It is towards South Korea and other Northeast Asian countries that pipelines from eastern Siberia to Pacific and Sakhalin oil and gas projects are orientated. Russia actively cooperates with China, South Korea, and Japan in peaceful use of nuclear energy too. Tremendous energy potential could be offered by the Asian Super Ring project, aimed at integrating power grids of Russia, Northeast China, Mongolia, South Korea, and Japan. Hydropower plants of Siberian and Far Eastern regions of Russia are supposed to become main donors to the ring, with Russia as a key crossroads for daily energy flow between the member countries. The project was proposed as long ago as 1998, but is still waiting for implementation. We can see that last 2 years, more interest has been shown for that project from our partners, including Japan. There is also an innovatory project of a tidal powerhouse of a unique 8,000 megawatt capacity in the Tugursky Bay in Khabarovsky Krai in the Russian Far East, which could become a basic component of a united international power grid of Northeast Asia. Construction of the Tugursky tidal powerhouse, which is to be a new, in essence, ecologically clean electric power producer using the kinetic energy of the Earth's rotation as its engine, could become an energy breakthrough of global importance. There were references today already for the experience of European Union and Organization of Security in Europe. let us recall that the European Union was started in 1950 from the community, European Community of Steel and Coal. Maybe the system of security in Northeast Asia starts from North Asian Community of Energy. What is also important, these projects of scale will help to develop confidence and trust among the countries of the region. Already there were references today that there is a lack of trust between partners. Nothing can strengthen mutual confidence and trust than the participation in joint economic projects of scale. Of course, there is already growing economic interdependency in the region. But interdependency alone cannot prevent a conflict. What is to prevent a conflict? It is joint work on projects of scale. And here I can refer to the Soviet experience of late 60s and 70s. You see, the Soviet Union laid first pipelines to West Europe that period. And you just recall the time, it was the time of Cold War, mutual mistrust, mutual threats in Europe. But the pipelines were laid to Western Europe, and leading European, West European companies started their participation in construction of huge industrial plants in USSR, like Volga automobile plant by Fiat, like some other plants. Joint work on this project helped to develop this mutual trust and confidence. People could better understand each other, the characters of each other, the needs of each other, and it finally led to detente in Europe of early 70s, and finally to Helsinki Conference of 1975, which established the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. You see? Of course, to blindly copy the experience of 40 years ago of Europe is not possible. But something from that experience could be used in Asia-Pacific and in Northeast Asia also. What is also important, that the process will bring results only in case that all states of the region, including the DPRK, take part. At the same time, no preconditions like that of complete nuclear disarmament should be laid down to Pyongyang for its admission to Northeast Asian Club. Russia, like other countries of the region, is very much concerned with the nuclear program, nuclear and missile program of Pyongyang. Because you see, those nuclear tests were held at the distance between 150 to 200 kilometers from our border. And you see, when missiles are launched from North Korea, we should not forget, yes, they can fall on Japan, but they can fall on Vladivostok also. That's why we are not less worried than you in South Korea or our colleagues in Japan. And we have voted for relevant sanctions in the United Nations Security Council. At the same time, we proceed from the stand that all work on the settlement of the Korean Peninsula nuclear problem should go within the framework of providing security guarantees to all states of the region, naturally including the DPRK. Those guarantees are to be strong and convincing, so that no one has any suspicion in regard to security. It is also very important to abstain from any actions which could aggravate tension around Korea. Along with unconditional denunciation of the nuclear tests and missile launches by Pyongyang, it is necessary to maintain a dialogue with Pyongyang and to go on with joint economic projects. We should proceed not from containment. We should proceed from engagement. If we insist on containment, we'll get no result. We'll get result only through engagement. The pull out of North Korea from isolation, as well as her social and economic advance, would be beneficial to all states of Northeast Asia. The DPRK is a member of the United Nations. She is recognized by the overwhelming majority of the states of the world. Hardly justified are the expectations of a near collapse of the DPRK state system. That system has repeatedly proved its endurance. The self-confident North Korea, which feels itself in relative security, is a much more reliable partner for talks on any issues than a country pushed in a corner under the burden of sanctions. Russia is prepared to bring an economic contribution to detente on Korean Peninsula. It would be advanced by practical implementation of large tripartite partnership projects of Russia as well as of North and South Koreas, such as Europe-Korea International Railway Corridor, Russia, the DPRK, the ROK gas pipeline, and already mentioned United Power Grid of Northeast Asia, incorporating power plants in the Russian Far East. You see, the nuclear issue of Korean Peninsula is actually internally linked with the fact that the Korean issue in general has not been settled. Therefore, the progress in settling the nuclear issue should go along with progress in inter-Korean relations also. I think that these are two wheels of the same cart, the progress in inter-Korean relations and the settlement of the nuclear issue of Korean Peninsula. Two wheels of the same cart which will bring us to peaceful Northeast Asia. And we discussed already today here the six-party talks. Actually, the participants of the talks achieved a lot. And if we look at the statement of 19 September of 2005, their main provision, not just for a progress in settling of nuclear issue of Korean Peninsula and in normalizing the inter-Korean relations. The approach to secure first the complete and final nuclear disarmament of North Korea while putting off the settlement of political problems inherited from the Korean War won't work. And here, we also should see that just straight demand to Pyongyang to nuclearize won't work. We should approach it through talks, through giving Pyongyang guarantees of its security, through convincing it to come into joint projects which will develop trust and confidence and through which they will learn that to be at peace and in cooperation with neighbors will be more fruitful than just open non-cooperation. And here, it is important to develop dialogue, and I hope that the initiative advanced by President Park Geun-hye will bring fruit, real fruit, to regional peace, to world peace, and new feathers to the cap of the Republic of Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Next turn is Mr. Evans Review.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ha. It is a very special honor for me to be here today, to be back in Seoul, a city that I lived in for more than 8 years over my diplomatic and military career. And it really is a very special treat to be in this particular building here today, honoring KNDA. I have a special memory in this building that goes beyond my long diplomatic association with the many excellent diplomats who have worked here and been trained here. A few years ago, when I was the chargé of the US Embassy, I was about to deliver a speech just down the hallway from this room when my BlackBerry went off, and the message came in that my grandson had been born. So needless to say, I was having trouble concentrating on my speech that day. Hopefully, I'll have better luck with my remarks today. I thought I would begin by just telling you that I've just come back a couple of weeks ago from a 2+ week tour of East and Northeast Asia. We visited, as a group, a US delegation of former senior officials, every one of the major capitals of Northeast Asia. And at the end of our 2+ weeks in the region, I came away very worried about where the region is and where the region may be going. And I also came away from that visit more positive than ever about the need for the sort of thoughtful, comprehensive initiative that President Park Geun-hye has put forward for our consideration. And so as I reflect on that visit and I reflect on the conclusions I drew from that very worrisome trip, I am also reflecting on the topic that we've been assigned to deal with here today. And I think this panel poses precisely the right question. If the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative is to succeed, what must be done? How can the regional powers, and here I would include the United States because we do regard ourselves as an Asia-Pacific power. We do have very powerful, strong, and close and cooperative relations with many countries in the region, and alliance relations with, of course, the Republic of Korea and Japan. So I include the United States in that. But how can we create the conditions for cooperation in this very dynamic region? And my thoughts that I'll share with you today are based on more than 45 years of working on or in this region. And as I contemplate how to respond to that question, I think the very first order of business for us is for regional powers to frankly recognize the obstacles and the challenges that lie in the way of regional cooperation. The obstacles and challenges that may prevent regional community building, and the obstacles and challenges that carry with them, as others have pointed out in this panel and this morning's panel, that carry with them the potential for misunderstanding in this region and even conflict. Ambassador Fu Ying earlier today in the session quoted an old Chinese proverb, and I thought I would quote an old Chinese philosopher, Confucius, who put forth the doctrine of Zhengming, in Korean Cheongmyeong, the rectification of names. And what he said was that people need to use the proper designations of things and to describe things by their rightful names in order for society to work in harmony. He stressed that it was important to understand and deal with reality for things to function properly. I think that was good advice 2,500 years ago, and I think it's very good advice today. And with that in mind, let me list, drawing on this idea of the rectification of names and calling things what they are, what I see are the fundamental challenges that we face in the region, and the list is not going to be unfamiliar to you. First, it would be a severe trust deficit between and among the regional powers. Also, I would add a rapid transformation in regional power relationships that has generated considerable uncertainty in Northeast Asia. I would say again that there's another critical point on this list, and that is that this is a region that is suffering very much from the burden of past conflict, occupation, colonialism, exploitation, and all of the resulting historical resentments, many of them highly emotional, that all those things have generated. We also have in this region competing and often contradictory versions of history. We have lingering territorial disputes. We have competing nationalisms, and the tendency of some in the region to use nationalism for political purposes, domestic political purposes. We have mistrust and suspicions that make it difficult for some parties in the region to accept as sincere statements of apology and regret. We have a lack of transparency about future defense and military intentions and plans, and then, of course, as others have said, we have the dangers posed by North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. That's not a comprehensive list, it's a partial list, but you see where I'm going in terms of the burdens and obstacles that lie ahead of us here. Drawing up a list, as I just have, is rather easy. Charting a way forward to resolve these problems and surmount the obstacles that I've named is not so easy. There's certainly not enough time today at this session to provide a detailed prescription for a way forward in dealing with all these challenges, but let me suggest 9 principles and guidelines that may help chart a course forward if we are to implement, as we hopefully will, President Park Geun-hye's excellent concept. Let me also preface this by reminding anybody who doesn't know me in this room that I tend to speak frankly, and I will do so today in the spirit of friendship and in the spirit of problem solving. So let me begin, just very quickly run through this list of 9 principles. The first is that each country in the region must recognize that failure to develop a firm foundation for peace and cooperation in this region is not an option. The stakes are too high to fail. This is a region that is vital to the world's economy. It's a region that contains some of the world's largest militaries. It's a region where miscalculation and misperception could lead to conflict. And we cannot allow this region to drift towards confrontation. Second, I would suggest, while I agree with all the points that have been made about the importance of the European experience and the importance of other experiences around the world, the lessons of Europe, including and especially the Helsinki process, are useful, quite useful. But Northeast Asia is not Europe. Prescriptions for securing regional cooperation and peace in this region should be based on Northeast Asia's unique historical experience, its unique cultures, and the very special and particular problems that this region faces. The third item that I would put on my list was actually referred to by President Park earlier this morning when she talked about developments in this region in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's a very important lesson for this region to draw from what happened during that period. During that period, as everyone in this room knows, the shifting tectonic plates of power in Northeast Asia roiled the region, and the history of this region in the late 19th and 20th centuries moved in a very, very troubling and ultimately tragic direction. The developments of that era, which put the region on, indeed, a tragic course for more than a century, must never be repeated. The next on my list is the issue of territorial disputes. These pose, obviously, a particularly volatile challenge for this region. And in my view, regional powers must acknowledge that some of these disputes may never be resolved in our lifetime. Rather than ramping up tensions, rather than raising the political and diplomatic temperature and risking confrontation, every effort must be made between and among the parties in the region to try to put as many of these disputes on the shelf as possible. And since, of course, as in the case of the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute, the shelf has become a lot higher to reach, it may be best to focus on more practical, short-term, and easier to reach goals, such as de-escalation, demilitarization, and seeking an extended time out among the parties to avoid further escalation. It goes without saying that warships and warplanes operating in close quarters without agreed rules of engagement and with unclear motives is a recipe for miscalculation and perhaps worse. And as a good colleague recently proposed, perhaps the best approach to dealing with this and perhaps some other problems in the region is, rather than trying to put it on the shelf, is to try to put it in the refrigerator. Next, development of resources in disputed areas. Joint development of resources or exploring ways to share resources produced in or near disputed territories and separating development and sovereignty issues may be a valuable way forward and should be considered. Next, fully reconciling the competing historical narratives that exist in this region may also prove, quite frankly, impossible. Eminent scholars in this region have been making some efforts to try to resolve differences of historical interpretation. Those efforts should certainly continue. But in the end, regional powers may have to accept the fact that the way forward is to acknowledge and accept, but not dwell on, the tragedies of the past and focus instead on developing future-oriented cooperative agendas. It has often been said that those who forget the past may be condemned to repeat it. But I would just add to that that those who live in the past are certainly condemned to stay there. You may not be able to unlearn the history that you have learned, but you can learn how to create a different future. Nationalism in this region, the next point I want to make, can be a very destructive force if it is exploited for domestic political purposes. Any regional power, in my view, that treads this path risks becoming a captive to forces that it may not be able to control. Next, it is understandable why sometimes questions are occasionally raised about whether apologies are sincere or not. But perhaps a better approach might be to accept statements of apology and regret for past actions at face value and then hold the other party to them. Locking in a former adversary to a statement of regret or apology in the eyes of the international community and insisting that he stand by his commitments may prove to be a much more useful technique than questioning the other party's sincerity. Finally, each party in the region, and I would add my own country to this list, but especially the resident powers in Northeast Asia, should acknowledge that they have a special responsibility to future generations to prevent conflict and to give those that follow them a better world. And towards that end, each power should aim to contribute what I've called a substantial down payment to the cause of creating the regional community of interests and aspirations envisioned in President Park's Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. In each instance, doing so will require each party in the region to set aside past resentments, calm current emotions, step back from maximalist positions, take the high road, and seek win-win outcomes. It will also be important for each country in the region, in my view, to ask itself whether it has done all it can to achieve reconciliation, whether it has done all it can to put the past in the box, as someone said earlier this morning, and whether it has done all it can to develop the forward-looking agenda that is so important in this region. And just one final thought. So far, what we are seeing in the region, regrettably, is the fact that this sort of approach that I have described has not been the model for intra-regional relations in recent years. And I would just say that if President Park's far-reaching and thoughtful initiative is to succeed, regional powers are going to need to adopt a new way of dealing with each other. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks for your recommendation of 9 principles. Next turn will be the Ambassador Takano Toshiyuki.
Thank you very much, Professor Ha, and thank you for the comments from my colleagues on the panel. I would like to congratulate KNDA and Ifans for my part for 50 years of very significant role you have played in the formulation of Korean foreign policy and also more generally to the peace and stability of the region and the world. So I'm very much privileged to be here today. Well, I would like to, listening to all the remarks, starting from President Park and all the panelists this morning and now, many things which I heard was exactly what I wanted to say in a way, different way. But in my view, I would like to point out there's in three categories the importance of this cooperation. Yes, there was a geopolitical changes in the 21st century, which is the emerging economies of dynamic economies going up. I recall that sometime in the 2008, 2007, that was a time when Western media started to think Asia as a region is the center of the world economy and not the US or Europe. And this was a big changes in the perception of the world as how Asia was looked at. Of course, Northeast Asia is a major beneficiary of this trend, and China, unfortunately, we don't have Chinese friend here, has played a central role in this development. Yes, we did have some slowdown in last 1 or 2 years in the economy of emerging countries, but everybody knows that Asian economy will play the central role in this dynamism. So as our friends on the panel said correctly, that it is special responsibility for the countries in the region to how to maintain this dynamism into the future is one of the crucial issues which are facing us today. This is because prosperous economy or prosperity in the region is the very foundation of the social stability, domestic social stability, and international situation. I was ambassador to Germany, and I have studied a little bit about European history in last century, and look at the enormous difficulty, economic difficulty in the first half of century. And it brought about political extremism, unhealthy nationalism, so on and so forth. And also we have tremendous unemployment among young people already now these days. This is common to all the countries, and this is one of the most worrisome elements. So for all these reasons, I think economic dynamism, prosperity is very important for all the region, and probably for the world, when world economy is still going through the uncertain waters. Well, I don't mean that I'm putting very important, hard issues in the political and security issue in this region. North Korean nuclear missile issues, tensions surrounding maritime and territory, and of course, trust is not enough among neighbors on the issue of past history, which I admit. And at this moment, I think I just say that Foreign Minister Maehara quite clearly stated probably government position on this issue this morning. Well, so for that purpose, I would like to give the step-by-step, albeit maybe small, but easier and softer approaches, which Vice Minister had showed us how to approach this issue. Of course, some of you don't trust ambassadors, particularly former ambassadors. I'm no longer have no official position in my government, so I just work for business in Japan. So please take it as a just a private citizen. First, touching upon this economy, further trade and investment liberalization. Particularly the tripartite FTA exercise is very important. I know that we had this official level discussion last month in Seoul here. I think this will be essential part for FTAP, Free Trade Agreement for Asia Pacific. Current government policy of Japan is how to revitalize Japanese economy after 15 years of deflation and slow growth. And one of the policy tools along this line is to integrate our economy further into the region and further into the world economy. Joining in the TPP negotiations and promoting trilateral free trade agreement with Korea and China are some of these examples. Second, again, Ambassador from Russia touched upon this. Cooperation on energy procurement, conservation, and efficiency is very important because the region will face increasing demand of energy resources as its economy expands further. Our dependency on the foreign resources will grow and not decrease. There are benefits to sharing information on price levels and market situation of energy resources. Exchanging technology, experiences on energy conservation and efficiency are very vital. On East China Sea oil and gas exploration, China and Japan should resume consultation based on the 2008 agreement. It is worth remembering that whole European community exercise started with the rather small but important coal and steel community by 3 small countries. So I think this is one of the areas we should have more emphasis to start. Third, environment and nuclear safety. We have major air and water pollution problem in the region developing. We do have some mechanism to discuss this, but I am one of those who feel that this is the current exercise is not enough. We should go further and deeper. Nuclear safety is another issue. For Japan, again, one of the current policy focus is how to deal with Fukushima tragedy. Decommissioning of the Fukushima #1 plant will take decades. So we have asked international cooperation to give us help and also ideas. And so far, we have 780 proposals who are registered with our ministry concerned. Also, I want to stress that there will be another 108 new nuclear plants going to be constructed in Asia, not necessarily in these 3 countries, but Asia Pacific. It's now about 400 something, so we'll have another 108 in maybe 20 years. So there's an utmost necessity to cooperate to avoid another catastrophe in nuclear safety. Fourth, this is touching upon the rather more difficult problems, which is confidence building measures in the military security area. Of course, when we talk about long-range architecture, it will take very long. As a very famous economist, Maynard Keynes said, we can talk about long-range measures, but if you take too long, all we did by that time. So we must also have some concrete but immediate measures. Those are like military exchanges between militaries. In Persian Gulf, as you know, off the Somalia, we have a large international military exercise to escort merchant fleets. And Korea, China, Japan, the NATOs are all involved. And there is a very good on-the-ground communication with even Chinese and Japanese militaries, which is my understanding from Japanese sources. INCSEA agreement, as you know, to avoid incidents at sea are helpful. 1993 INCSEA agreement with Russia and Japan is a very successful agreement, and our Navy has a first name calls with Russian counterparts. So these are small but kind of feasible steps we can take, like hotlines with China, with Japan. We're proposing for so many years now, not yet achieved. Fifth, but not least, we do have flurry of various ministerial talks in recent months, such as in environment, education, disaster controls at ministerial level, meeting among Korea, China, and Japan. But I think, frankly, we need higher level also meetings in trying to help dispersing misunderstanding and mistrust. My understanding is that the three-party summit talks are due before the end of this year. This week there were official level talks. I don't know the details of that meeting, but I think everybody is trying to finalize on the date for this meeting, and that will be a very good first step. Again, I might venture into our relation with Russia. We just had a 2+2 meeting involving foreign minister and defense minister with Russia. We do have 2+2 meeting with United States and Australia for some time, but this is the first time we did have 2+2 with Russia. We do have some difficult problems, bilateral problems, but we think that this kind of strategic and military contacts at high level is also helpful, along with the energy cooperation or manufacturing cooperation, technological cooperation. So I think there must be a way to kind of go side by side in this kind of ministerial talks and even higher talks. Lastly, I just want to, because I was ambassador here about 10 years ago, of my memories at that time. This was the beginning of Hanryu what we call Hangul is the Korean culture wave in Japan. Very famous actor Tae-yul was the top star here, but also more so in Japan. Last week, Paul McCartney came to Haneda Airport after 40 years. But I remember 1996, the original Beatles came to Haneda, same Haneda Airport, and there was about 3,000 or 4,000 ladies flocked. But when Tae-yul went to Japan, if I recall, 2003 or 4, again, 4,000 ladies flocked to Haneda. And some of them are daughters and mothers. Daughter was 50 years old, and the mother was 80 years old. And I was one of those men, Japanese men, totally isolated by Japanese ladies, which is still going on. Despite some of these media reports that, yes, there's some unfortunate downturn in the mutual public opinion figures, but if you look at Japanese TV these days, more Korean TV drama is on. Almost every major TV is there. Ma-ii, the horse doctor, and Tong-ii is the now most favorite in Japanese ladies. So these things are going on. And also on this economic front, when I was ambassador here, there was no case of Japanese and Korean firms collaborating in third countries. That was rare. I mean, but now there's, I would say, dozens or maybe even more. I personally know one of them in Brazil. Were a little bit involved in Namiza iron ore project, where POSCO and Itochumai, where I now serve as an advisor, collaborate. There's one project in Ghana or in Australia, and also Canada, also in this case with China. So over these 10 years, there's an enormous development in the joint ventures, particularly in third countries. So this is what we have to put in perspective of our relations. And I'm one of those who feel that I'm quite optimistic about the future, because after all, we share the common values, market economy, democratic principles, and so on and so forth. We are neighbors which we cannot relocate ourselves. We have a long history. Albright, yes, we have done tremendous damage to Korean people in the first half of last century, which we, as you know, we are everybody in Japan, including the current government, acknowledges that we have to express our apology and sincere remorse. But anyhow, I'm one of the Japanese who are quite optimistic about our relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Last but not least, Professor Hugh White, your turn.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ha. It's a great pleasure to share the platform with such a distinguished group. I must say I found it a very interesting discussion so far, and it's a great privilege to be here to help KNDA celebrate its 50th anniversary. If one thinks of the distance Korea has come in that 50 years and the way in which Korea's diplomats have helped to forge for Korea a really remarkable position in the world as a model of how middle powers should do diplomacy, those who built this institution and those who have run it can take great pride in their work. And it's typified, I think, by the very interesting ideas that we've seen articulated here today by the President, of course, by the Foreign Minister and by the Vice Minister. It's a very sophisticated and nuanced policy idea that we've been asked to discuss here. And what I want to do to contribute to that is to, if you like, take a slightly gloomy view of things. It tends to be what I do for a living, and to say, okay, how far can we go with what one might call the bottom-up approach, and how do we need to think about managing the broader context in which that bottom-up approach is going to be undertaken? Because I think when we ask ourselves what kind of setting will we need for the kinds of issues, including many of the ones that my colleagues on this panel have discussed, what kind of setting is going to be needed for that to succeed in bringing about a significant improvement in the security environment in Northeast Asia? I think we do have to go back and ask ourselves the deeper question about the sources of that Asian paradox that the President spelled out in her speech this morning. That is, that we have in Asia, and particularly in Northeast Asia today, an era of remarkable prosperity, phenomenal prosperity, really. I mean, typified, of course, by South Korea's achievements, but also in Japan and China and so on. And that prosperity has been built on a remarkably stable international order in Northeast Asia, obviously with the very special exception of the issues on the Korean Peninsula itself. But if we look back over the 50 years in which this institution has been running, and particularly if we look back at the 40 years since 1972, when the US-China relationship was so revolutionised, we have lived through what has been almost certainly the most peaceful and stable era in Asia's history. And that stability and peace has provided the foundation for the prosperity which characterises the region. But at the same time, that prosperity, the growing wealth of the region, has shifted the distribution of power between the states in the region in a way which is undermining the foundation of that stability which has caused it. So we have a genuine kind of paradox here, that the stability, the stable order which has provided the foundation for the prosperity of the last 40 years is now starting to be eroded by by its own consequences, that prosperity. Now, it's tempting to think, and I think the Foreign Minister mentioned this morning, that we might be fated to relive history here. There's, what the scholars call the Thucydides trap, that when we see a region in which relative power is shifting very fast, some countries are rising, challenging the position of established orders, we automatically find ourselves with escalating strategic rivalry and even conflict. And I think it's terribly important that we all understand that that's not the case in Northeast Asia. There's no reason to be so pessimistic as to believe that the region is fated to relive what happened in Greece 2,500 years ago, or even what happened in Europe 100 years ago next year. And apart from anything else, one of the reasons for that is the incentives to get it right. The incentives to avoid that are so great, because if we do get this right, the Asian century can be so good for all of us. But we also have to recognise there are real risks here. It's not, so to speak, a coincidence that again and again in history, as power is redistributed, as relative wealth changes, as in other words, we go through exactly the processes which are characterising Asia today, again and again we have seen that kind of escalating strategic rivalry. We have seen a breakdown in the order which has been fundamental to the economic growth which we've all celebrated. And so I think we have to recognise that there are real risks in Asia today. And I think one of the most important things about President Park's initiative is how clearly she recognises those risks and her commitment to help address them. And as she said this morning, those risks include the risks of conflict. We need to be very careful not to regard conflict as inevitable, but we also need to be very careful not to regard it as impossible. We need to recognise that the downside of getting this wrong could be major conflict between the hugely powerful states in this region, which will be catastrophic for all of us. So we ask ourselves, what's necessary to avoid that? What's necessary to build a new set of relationships between the strongest powers in the region, which could prevent that happening? Well, I think the beginning to that is the insight that the basis of order, including the basis of the order that's kept Asia so peaceful and prosperous for the last 40 years, is the relationship between the great powers. It's an old-fashioned phrase, but it captures something very important. That is, the way an order works, the way a region works, depends more than anything else on how the strongest countries in the region get on with one another, because they're the ones that set the pattern for the rest of us. And what's distinctive about Asia for the last 40 years, what's provided the stable setting for everything that's been achieved, has been more than anything else the remarkable role that the United States has played and the way in which the other countries in the region, particularly the great powers, China and Japan, have accepted that. As I said before, I think 1972 is the key date here. That was the year in which China accepted American primacy as the foundation for the regional order. And I think it's been enormously beneficial to all of us that that's happened. But today, of course, the distribution of wealth and power in the region is fundamentally different from the way wealth and power was distributed in 1972. In 1972, China's economy was about 1/20th the size of America's. Today, we are living in a world in which it would be wise to expect that China's economy will in fact equal America's in the not too distant future, perhaps even overtake it. We shouldn't be surprised that when we remember that what we're living through is the biggest shift in the distribution of wealth and power in history, which is what the rise of China is, that this is driving a fundamental change in the nature of the relationships between these great powers. We can't assume that Asia can go through this fundamental economic transformation and remain unchanged strategically and politically. We can't assume that the model of great power relations, if I can borrow that phrase from President Xi Jinping, that the old model of great power relations, which has served Asia so well for the last 40 years, is going to keep working to keep the region peaceful in future. And that's why I think Xi Jinping is right to say that we need a new model of great power relations in Asia. Of course, much depends on what that new model looks like, and I'm not quite sure what President Xi has in mind. But let me just tell you what I think it will need to look like. And I think it's very difficult. I think we'll need to look for a new model of great power relations in Asia in which the United States continues to play a very big and important role. But it will be a different role from the role it's played since 1972. It'll be a region in which China has to play a bigger role than the role it's played, not just since 1972, but you might say going back through the centuries since China's power collapsed perhaps 200 years ago. So I think we will be looking for an order in which China plays a much bigger role, but not one in which it dominates the region, not going back to the days of the Middle Kingdom. In other words, we're looking for a regional order in which America is accommodating China's aspirations to play a much bigger role in Asia, and that means the US and China have a very different kind of relationship to the one they've had in the past, but also an order in which China accepts that the United States is going to continue to play a very strong role. That sounds to me like an order in which the United States and China are partners in a shared regional order, each treating one another as equals, as equal partners. Now that's easy to say. It's extremely hard to imagine how it would look and work. Even harder when you remember that the US and China are not the only two great powers in the region. Japan also, I think in particular, must have a place in this new order, in this new model of great power relations, which ensures for Japan the security and dignity that it deserves. Now, I think it's going to be extraordinarily hard for the region to imagine what that kind of set of relationships between great powers should look like and to work towards building it. It's going to be very hard for the key players themselves. For all of them, it's going to require them to rethink the way they manage their most important relationships and therefore rethink the way they see themselves. The stakes are very high. If they get it right, as some of my colleagues on the panel have said, we could have a region and over the next few decades of great peace and prosperity and harmony. If we get it wrong, we could have an absolute catastrophe. And it would be very unwise to just sit back and hope that the region and the region's great powers would somehow just drift into this kind of new model. The risk is they'll drift in the opposite direction. The risk is already there, in fact, that they're drifting in the opposite direction, drifting towards escalating rivalry and distrust rather than to escalating cooperation and trust. And it's going to take real leadership, real statesmanship to move off that track towards escalating rivalry, towards a track of increased trust and cooperation. And that process is going to be unsettling for them, the great powers. It's also going to be unsettling for us, if I can put it that way, the middle and smaller powers. It's going to be unsettling for us to recognise that the region is going to work differently, that the strongest states in the region are going to get on with one another differently, and that our relationships middle and smaller powers relationships with the stronger states will have to change. But I don't think we're going to have any alternative if we're going to provide the foundations for a peaceful and stable order over the next few decades. And I think the support that the small and middle powers can play to the great powers as the great powers wrestle with this question of their future relations with one another is terribly important. And when I look at the initiatives that President Park's been taking and the way and the leadership role she's taken in the region promoting these sets of ideas, I think it's a very good example of the way in which we smaller and middle powers, if I can categorise Australia and South Korea in that group, can help to contribute to that process of building this kind of basic foundation in the Asian order for the kind of outcome we all want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor White. Thanks for all the interesting presentation of the 5 panelists. I own some about the major points so far raised up. I would rather, because we only have roughly 30 minutes, I would rather discuss or give a little bit more emphasis on the so-called Asian paradox in a little bit broader perspective, because most of the presentation, from my point of view, is that one point is that there might be a hope and there might be some expectation of further elaboration or development of implementation processes of the second cluster of economic challenges or second cluster of new agenda challenges. But at the same time, there is a clear dilemma. Even though we can elaborate very much the second and third cluster of challenges, successfully managed to cluster up challenges, there is always risk of the first cluster of challenges, such as the political-military cluster of changes. So I would rather ask the question first to the US and Japan panelists, and after that, I would like to also hear the Russian and Australian view, and finally, our Vice Minister will give a short comments on that. The question I would like to propose that if the first cluster of challenges is still critically important, I think there are 2 major factors we seriously consider. One is China factors, second one is Japan factors. In the case of China factors, there are some different positions on that future of China and US relations or relations between US and the trilateral network of US, Japan, and Korea. So from the US side, well, there might be a pretty good chances of the potential partnership with China. On the other hand, Japan is very much cautious about accepting that kind of position. So we should frankly discuss a little bit further on the future of the China factors. And secondly, Japan factors will, as we all know, Japan is now trying to increase the military role and military capabilities for the collective defense. Well, however, in spite of that good purposes, there are still some kind of the strategic distrust from the Korea or China. In that case, how should we solve this kind of dilemma? For instance, Premier Abe's basic position is that the proactive peace based on international cooperation, but from the Korea and China perspective, international cooperation should be given a much more emphasis when the proactive peace of Japan further implemented in this region. So we have a little bit more frank discussion about that. And my second question, when we do have a rather successful arrangement of second cluster and third cluster of challenges, such as the economy and new agenda, will that kind of the successful effort will contribute to the lesson to positively affect on the current dilemmas of first cluster of questions? I know it's a very tough questions, but I would like the microphone over to Mr. REVERE.
Certainly, thank you very much. You've given us enough food for thought and questions that we could go on for another 2.5 hours, but I see that we've got 27 minutes, so I'll be very, very brief. During the recent visit to Asia that I mentioned I had participated in, we had a rather schizophrenic set of conversations in Beijing, to be very frank with you. The majority of our Chinese interlocutors were still were very positive and upbeat about U.S.-China relations, the overall relationship, the overall trajectory and trend of the relationship. I think they were still basking in the warm afterglow of the Sunnyland Summit, and so they were feeling very positive about the future prospects for U.S.-China cooperation. And most members of our delegation were in a similar place. But there was also another view that was heard in Beijing. We met with a couple of very senior members of the People's Liberation Army who provided us with one of whom provided us with an hour-long lecture on the evils of American efforts to surround China and stifle China's development, et cetera. And so I think the lesson I came away with is that there are those in China who may have a different perspective on the future of U.S.-China relations. There are those who are charged with China's defense and security who look at the relationship with the United States with a rather skeptical eye. And quite frankly, if I think you were to go into the bowels of the Pentagon and the U.S. Joint Staff, you might find some mirror imaging of that among some of our defense people as well. The bottom line here is that China and the United States are bound to some degree to hedge against each other. There's bound to be some residual mistrust, particularly as America and others in the region deal with a Chinese military force that is very rapidly modernizing and developing new capabilities. So it's natural, I think, for us to look at China and be a bit uncertain as to their intentions. And the same thing goes vis-a-vis the United States with respect to China. So there is this element of hedging there. But I think fundamentally, the political leaderships in both countries, the diplomatic leaderships in both countries, are on a positive track, and they realize that the upsides of cooperation greatly outweigh the negative perceptions that they sometimes have about each other. There's certainly, I think, a consensus among U.S. experts, U.S.-China experts, that the notion of treating China as an enemy is a very foolish path to pursue, and I think most American China experts would agree with that. And that's certainly the view inside the U.S. administration. There is a genuine, heartfelt desire on the part of Washington up and down the line, including most people at the Pentagon, I would say, to work out a cooperative relationship with China, not only in East Asia and Northeast Asia, but beyond as well. If the United States and China are at odds in this region will simply not function well. And I think both parties understand that. If the United States and China are able to work together cooperatively, there may be no limit to what we can do in this region, I think, to be quite frank with you. But always in the background, in the shadows, you'll see this element of hedging, just because it's the nature of the game in the region. A rising power, as you put it earlier, a status quo power, if you will, changing power relationships and all that. But I think at the end of the day, I come down on the side of cautious optimism in terms of our ability to work out a good and productive relationship with China, including in the military dimension. A very core component of US dialogue with China these days is military-to-military dialogue. There's an unprecedented level of very frank and very far-reaching dialogue between the US military and with the Chinese military, and that's a very good thing. Just one or two words on Japan, if I might. As long as I've spent working in Korea on security issues, I've actually spent even longer in Japan working on security issues. And this trilateral relationship, as Secretary Albright stated this morning, is absolutely critical in this region. I was there on the ground floor working through these issues of trilateral cooperation in the mid to late 90s, working on issues primarily related to North Korea, but working on broader strategic and tactical cooperation between and among us. And we've done some amazing work as allies and partners over the years. Right now, as people have pointed out, things are in a bit of a rough patch between Tokyo and Seoul. But fundamentally, I think the vast majority of Koreans understand the point that was made in one of the panels this morning, which is that a well-functioning, very close and very capable US-Japan security relationship is absolutely essential to the defense of the Republic of Korea. If, heaven forbid, there were to be a second Korean War, you could not prosecute such a war. You could not hope to win such a war without US bases in Japan and the defense cooperation that exists between the United States and Japan. I think another important point to remind everyone of, and this is something that Secretary Hagel said when he was here just a few weeks ago, is that the changes that are happening to Japan's defense programs and policies and deployments, et cetera, are happening within the context of the US-Japan Security Alliance relationship. There are no surprises here. These are things that we have all known and expected for many years. And it's happening strictly within the context of a very close and cooperative relationship between Washington and Tokyo. And as these changes are happening, as they're being made, they are, in my view, but more importantly in the view of defense experts in Washington, directly contributing to our ability to strengthen the preservation of peace and stability in this region. And I think that's a good thing. I think if there have been any failings, it's been in the ability to articulate, and I'll let my Japanese colleague pick it up from here, the ability to articulate the overall direction that Japan is going in, and to put these changes in the defense arena into a broader policy context and a broader strategic context. And I think perhaps more effort should be done in that regard. But I, for one, I understand some of the misgivings here in Seoul. I'm a historian, I know the history. But I think everyone needs to understand the point that I made, that the changes that we see happening are happening within a very clear regional context and a very clear context of the US-Japan alliance. Stop there.
Thank you. Ambassador Takano.
Thank you very much. On our relations with China, yes, we have some difficulty, particularly over the territory issue, tensions still going on. But there is agreement between China and Japan that our relations is of what we call mutually beneficial strategic relations. And on that point, when we talk, even now, everybody agrees, both sides. I did not participate myself, but one of my colleagues participated in one of those 1.5 or second track discussion like this in Beijing. And they are in absolute agreement that this is the fact. We can benefit by better and constructive relations. As you know, this is the 35th anniversary of our formal normalization of our two nations in 1978. And we agreed on many principles of course, like respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, equality, mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. And even two countries agreed that both countries will not seek for hegemony at that time. One Indian scholar said that Asia Pacific is such a vast area, so no one country cannot control it. They are not strong enough, whoever it may be. So we need some kind of cooperation one way or another. Well, on the territorial issue, we are trying to solve this issue by peaceful means, of course, and we object the changes of status quo by force. This is the basic point of Japanese position. On the Japanese recent security and military steps we are taking, there's several of them, of course. On collective defense right, this is, of course, supported by the US government in the 2+2 agreement recently. And now it's deliberated in the commission set up under the cabinet. They have not come up with any conclusion on the National Security Council debate or legislation which is going on right now in our diet. This is one of the things which what we want is to make all this strategic decision-making in Japan more efficient, which is very important in time of crisis, when competing interest in different part of our government is very unhealthy. I can go on all this. You talked about proactive peace policy. This is only my understanding is to contribute even more actively to the peace and stability of not only this region but world, in like PKO and other approaches. I think this particular, for instance, approach, I recall that was appreciated by China themselves. In 2008, Hu Jintao visited Japan officially, and we had a joint statement. And they said specifically that they appreciate this Japanese greater role in this world, role in peace and stability. Again, I do not want to go a long list of why we think what we are doing is anything to be concerned about. That we are doing this under strict principle of so-called peaceful nation, under the Constitution, under the US-Japan security arrangement, under the spirit of UN Charter, and nobody is thinking of taking a military adventure like what we did in the first half of last century. For instance, we talk about military defense expenditure. If you please check with the SIPRI Swedish think tank report recently, that last 10 years, if I may quote, all the countries, including Australia, US, China, Korea, they increased the expenditure. In case of China, 4 times, quadruple. Japan decreased last 10 years by 5%. It's a kind of political commitment that we keep our defense expenditure at 1% of GNP, and we are something like 0.9 whatever still. So we, as you know, we are committed not to become major military power. Of course, with the help of United States. We committed to have no offensive weapons like long-range missiles, long-range bombers. We have a strict commitment to three non-nuclear principles and so on. So these are things we will not change, whatever we are probably what are contemplated or debated in Japan. I admit that there's a lot of concerns among our neighbors, but in the final analysis, direct communication on these issues is the key to alleviate these concerns. Don't go to the media, Japanese or otherwise, because they try to paint in one way or another, sometimes out of context. So if you talk to these officials directly, and I believe that we are completely committed to transparency and openness on this process of Japanese policy making. So on this point, I stop this.
Okay, thank you. Professor White, could you sum up these issues and
Yes, I'll try and be quick, although you've tempted us with a very interesting set of questions. Let me say a couple of things about the US-China relationship, because I think it is fundamental to everything we're talking about. And the good news is I don't doubt for a moment that everyone in Beijing and everyone in Washington wants a stable and peaceful relationship with the other. And the other bit of semi-good news, and I think I agree with Evan here, is that actually in both Beijing and Washington, you see a distinct air of optimism about the trajectory of the relationship. I've spent a bit of time in Beijing and in Washington in the last couple of months, and in both cities I've heard versions of the idea of the spirit of Sunnylands. You know, things are going pretty well. But I'm cautious about their optimism, because when I talk to American friends and I talk to Chinese friends, I get the distinct sense that they have fundamentally different objectives. The core US objective in Asia today is to preserve the status quo based on American primacy. It's not to say they're not prepared to make some concessions to China, but they don't see a fundamental change in the nature of the US-China relationship and the role of the United States in Asia. Whereas when I talk to my friends in Beijing, I get the sense that they do want something fundamentally different. They're not quite sure what it is, or if they are, they're not telling us. But when President Xi Jinping talks about a new model of great power relations, it means he doesn't like the old one. And so we have this paradox that both sides are optimistic about the trajectory of the relationship, but they both want fundamentally different things. The conclusion, they both think they're going to win. In the United States, I think there's a fair level of confidence that China is in the end going to accept the status quo, accept American primacy as a foundation for the Asian order, even as China's economy approaches and perhaps overtakes America's. And in China, I think there's a fair degree of confidence that what with one thing and other things on their plate, and the sequester and the shutdown and Syria and all those other things that begin with S, that the United States will somehow say to China, okay, you know, if you want to play a bigger role, that's fine. Now, I think that's quite a dangerous situation, actually, because they've got fundamentally different objectives and they both think that the other side's going to give way. This is actually how strategic rivalries start. And that's why I think it's very urgent that there be a lot of frank talking between them. And that's why I think it's very urgent that they both sit down and negotiate or agree on their differences at least and agree on a way forward. I'm sure there is a model for the US-China relationship in which both can get what they really essentially need, but I'm not sure either of them are getting towards it at the moment. And just to finish, what about the rest of us? It does seem to me that all of us in Asia have essentially the same set of interests in the future of the US-China relationship. We all want the United States to continue to play a very strong role in Asia, because there seems no way that you can have a stable future in Asia without the United States playing a very strong role. But we all very much value our own relationships with China, and we all very much fear the consequences for us and for the region as a whole of escalating rivalry between the United States and China. So we all want the United States to stay in Asia, but we all want the United States to stay in Asia on a basis that China is in the end prepared to accept. And so we want the US and China to negotiate a new model, again to use President Xi's expression, a new model of great power relations. And we want America to accept that it's going to have to share power with China in some kind of way, and we want China to accept that the United States has to continue to play a very significant role in the region. And I think they both still have a little way to go to get to that. On the issue of Japan, this is a terribly difficult question. And I fear that some in a Korean audience might find what I'm about to say uncomfortable. Japan has a real strategic problem. As China's power grows, Japan is, for reasons I understand, increasingly anxious about what kind of relationship it's going to have with China. And moreover, as China's power grows, I think Japan recognises that the threshold for American support to Japan against China in any crisis must go up, because the stronger China is, the higher the cost and risk to the United States of supporting Japan over any particular issue. And so I think Japan feels more and more anxious about its relationship with China, and ultimately less and less confident about support from the United States, notwithstanding, I know, the very strong political commitment in the United States to the relationship. And some of these dilemmas, I think, can be seen in the way the issues are playing out in the East China Sea over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands issue at the moment. So it does seem to me that Japan does need a new model of its own strategic posture. The model that's worked so well for Japan since the end of the Second World War, I think, is working less well now. And I think the rest of the region, all of us in the region, are going to have to be rather tolerant of Japan's efforts to work this out. It's very difficult for Japan internally. It's made harder because it does seem impossible within Japan to separate questions about its strategic future from questions about its strategic past. And it's terribly important that the Japanese do that, more than they are at the moment. But it's also, I think, very important that the rest of us recognise that Japan does deserve a stable and secure future of its own. And I just make the point that whatever we feel about the history, and I understand why Koreans feel so strong and bitter about this, Japan is simply not in a position to be in the future the kind of threat to the region it was in the past, because it's simply not as powerful as it was. It's still an enormously powerful country with a great future, but the Japan which did so many terrible things in Asia in the first half of the last century was by far and away the strongest country in Asia. And it's simply not that anymore, and is never going to be that again. So I think we need to be realistic in recognising just how big a threat Japan could be, even if it were to misuse its power, and I don't for a moment think it would. Lastly, on your point about clusters 1, 2 and 3, it would be nice if we could address these really hard issues, like the ones I've just been talking about in cluster 1, through the back door by dealing with the still important and difficult issues in cluster 2 and 3. Because the really hard issues, the ones about the nature of the US-China relationship, who leads the region, what role does Japan play, these really hard issues are terribly difficult to deal with or even to talk about. But I think in the end, we can't get to them just by the back door. We can't get to them just by dealing with the issues on the category 2 and 3. We do need to deal with the issues in categories 2 and 3. They are very important in their own right. But I think we'd be unwise to assume that if we can solve the little problems, somehow the big problems will look after themselves. I think actually it's the other way around. We've got to solve the big problems. We've got to build a really shared understanding of the kind of region we're going to live in and the kind of relationships that are going to shape that region before we can get down and deal with the other really important questions that fall in the other categories. Thank you.
Would you kindly briefly sum up the Russian view on the issues we have discussed so far? Very briefly.
And I think there is one difference between, say, Soviet-American competition and Chinese-American competition. There is one principal difference. Soviet-American competition was very ideologized. Chinese-American competition does not have ideology bearing. But another difference is that the Soviet Union wanted to change the whole system. The Chinese do not want to change the system. They are competing with United States within the system, and they want to reform the system according to their needs. That's why there is such an active, say, worries from the American part, because China is a rising giant, and they have more, say, passion in that. And it is very interesting how to look at that, because you see, no armed conflict is possible now with all the weapons that both sides possess. The competition is by peaceful means, by economic means, but it doesn't mean that this competition will be less acute.
Okay, thank you. Well, finally, I will ask the Vice Minister Cho give a final few words to conclude the second session.
While the other panelist is free of official duty, I'm not. So it would be far more difficult for me to answer the questions, particularly the first question you raised. But I have to answer anyway. But I must first emphasize that the trilateral relationship among China, Japan, and Korea has been rapidly emerging in recent years, and the relations among the three countries on a bilateral basis have been in a good shape. So it was only the recent phenomenon that the relations have been strained. So I'm basically optimistic about the future. And one good news is that apparently the Chinese leadership has changed its basic attitude to the security issues in Northeast Asia, particularly in terms of the North Korean nuclear issue. And in the past, the priority has been given to the maintenance of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. But the Chinese leadership has made it clear on many occasions in recent months that their first priority will be put on the resolution of the nuclear issue of North Korea rather than the maintenance of peace and stability on the peninsula. This is a fundamental change on the part of the Chinese policy. But we have to wait and see whether this is a change in their views on the strategic importance of North Korea as a kind of buffer state. This is something we have to work out in the coming years. And in regard to the Japan factor, I think I have to emphasize once again that our basic position, the basic position of the current administration in terms of our bilateral relationship with Tokyo was not that much negative at the beginning. But in my personal view, the first button was wrongly fixed by the Japanese side at the beginning of this administration. So my personal view is that the ball is now in the court of Japan. So even though we are ready to improve the current relations between Seoul and Tokyo as soon as possible, but something has to be fixed before we move ahead. And then this is the message we have been delivering to Tokyo in the last several months, but unfortunately, we have not yet found the common ground based upon which we move forward. But I'm not that much pessimistic about the future of our bilateral relationship, as was mentioned by Ambassador Takano. And you referred to the collective defense, but I think the discussions between Washington and Tokyo are still underway in terms of what kind of content to be put into that arrangement between Washington and Tokyo. So it is quite premature for us to make any official comments on that. But on many occasions in the past, we have made it clear that the discussions on collective defense as well as strengthening the defense capabilities of Japan should be undertaken in a very transparent manner and in a way that addresses fully the concerns and apprehensions of the neighboring countries arising from the unfortunate past in recent history. So this is a basic position and a reaction from our part to Tokyo. And regarding your second question on the second and third clusters, I would like to point out that the three clusters you mentioned in your intervention is quite similar to the three baskets in the concept of the comprehensive security, which was envisioned by the Europeans in moving toward the Helsinki process. But the second and third cluster is included in the second cluster of the comprehensive security concept. So one missing element is human dimension. The human rights, what to do with the human dimension in moving toward the security kind of mechanism in Northeast Asia is something we have to deal with in the coming years. And but I have some more things to comment on the trilateral relationship among China, Japan, and Korea. During my diplomatic career of over 30 years, I sometimes and often find myself in a position to play a kind of facilitator's or interlocutor's role between Tokyo and Beijing. Whenever I attended ASEAN +3 or ASEAN +1 conference, there are always a kind of discrepancies or conflicting views and proposals coming from both either Japan and China. So sometimes I have to casting vote sometimes. Otherwise, there will be no final solution. In ASEAN +3 framework, in order for one project to be approved by the entire membership, the approval should be done by 10 plus 2. So if the Chinese and Japanese do not come to terms with each other, then Korea has to come into play. So this indicates that there is some room for Korea to play in terms of the trilateral relationship among Tokyo, Japan, and Seoul. So this is one area where we have to see what kind of increasing and invisible role we can play in the coming years.
Okay, thank you. It is my guess the present decade of 2010 will be remembered to build the new architecture of Asia-Pacific order for the peace and prosperity. In that perspective, I think today's very much interesting discussions by the panelists will contribute to draw the collective blueprint for the sustainable, practical, and beautiful new order in the region. Thank you very much for the panelists and all the participants from the floor. Thank you very much.
토론에 수고해 주신 하영선 동아시아연구원 이사장님과 세계 각국 패널 분들께 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.